The story begins with the events that took place among the snow-white frosty peaks covered with a thick layer of snow and ice. A young girl was lying in the middle of a snowy meadow and did not move. The wind mercilessly blew her hair, the same color as the snow. She voluntarily accepted her death because she had no more reasons to live. This young girl had no friends, no family, no beloved husband. There was absolutely nothing that could keep her in this world, so she, lying on the frozen ground, thought that it would be good for her to freeze. Only somewhere in the distance could be heard the crunch of snow from the confident steps of a young man who was approaching this girl. Coming closer, he said that it was quite absurd to leave life like that. The man said that it was in the spirit of the Empress to lie here among the snowy hills, as if she had decided to rule over them in this snowy winter kingdom, abandoned by everyone here to die. The man came closer to the young girl and leaned next to her, trying to understand if there were still signs of life. He saw that the young girl was barely alive, and it was hard not to notice. The young girl felt that some man approached her and therefore barely opened her eyes. She did not see clear facial features, and her feeling told her that she had seen him somewhere before. The young man leaned towards her and courageously took her in his arms. Then as he pulled her closer to him, he felt her heart still beating, and God only knew how much it had left. Holding the barely alive young girl in his arms, the man said that in such a case he would gladly take her with him, and the Empress would belong to him from now on. 3 months before the events that took place among the snow-covered hills, in the bedroom of Emperor Thanatos, a half-naked man was having a conversation with his mistress. The woman first showered the emperor with compliments in a seductive tone, and then offered to finally get rid of the Empress so that she would not interfere with their happy life. The woman hugged the emperor and tried to prove to him that he would be much better with Natalia, and only the Empress stood in the way of their carefree future. She whispered in his ear so that he must gather courage and finally take this step, getting rid of his wife and strengthening his power in the empire of Thanatos, because of his wife, he is always in the shadows. Thanatos was a golden empire among the boundless realms of ice, and everything in this world was supposed to belong to Emperor Gigliotti. But he could not do anything without the consent of the Empress. Every night his mistress pushed him to a coup d'etat because she really wanted to take the place of the Empress next to these men. Therefore, she whispered that she would take the Empress's brother on her. She already had an insidious plan in her head, how to remove her brother from the ruling top of the Thanatos Empire, because this woman had a very attractive appearance that no one could resist. Her plan was to seduce him and then accuse him of rape. She did not doubt the success of her plan, because she had already had similar cases in her experience, which she was very proud of. Every evening, when meeting with his mistress, the emperor considered their plan but did not weigh in on the final decision, although his beloved assured him every night of 100% success. She satisfied the emperor as best she could, telling in parallel that the Empress would definitely try to save her brother and thereby further bury her reputation in political showdowns. The mistress assured that the Empress, who would try to get her brother out of this mess and whiten his reputation, would look like a vile criminal in the eyes of the courtiers and aristocrats. Then the mistress added that evidence of treason would be found in the Empress's brother's room, which she herself would put there in advance to further implicate the Empress's relatives. And when the investigators of the empire come to examine this evidence, in those papers it will be written in his own hand that he committed this crime only because his sister the Empress hates His Highness and Natalia. Her words were told so perfectly that the emperor wanted to believe in the success of their cause, so he embraced his mistress and tried to kiss her passionately. But Natalia did not let him do this, and with a skillful movement turned him over so that he was under her. Looking down on him, she said that she would have one request for her emperor. The man looked at his mistress with a surprised look, and she continued that she wanted the Empress's limbs broken before they could proceed with their plan. The next thing that Natalia asked His Highness was that he get rid of all the people who were dear to the Empress, so that she would remain completely alone and would not be able to receive support. But Natalia's sick fantasy did not stop there. She added that the Empress should appear in the banquet hall in front of the Emperor and the guests who will gather for this grand event. Then Natalia will take up the matter again, who will approach the Empress and say that she carries the Emperor's child under her heart, and this will be the last nail they drive into her coffin. After all, because of the accusations of her own brother and personal jealousy, the Empress cannot stand it and will try to kill the Emperor's son, and thus she will fall into a trap from which there is no way out. Natalia told the Emperor her plan with such zeal that the man believed that they would be able to carry it out in the smallest details. She was waiting for a final decision from him. The woman squeezed her lover's hands tighter and continued to tell their future, because as a result of the Empress's crimes, all her relatives must necessarily intervene to protect her. Natalia assured the Emperor that everything should turn out as they planned, and added that it was at that moment that the Emperor would need to draw his sword and deal with the Empress's relatives once and for all. Passionately kissing his neck, Natalia added that the Empress must be very cunning, so that His Highness could not find her for punishment, but she should not count on that. The seductress continued to fantasize, telling that the Emperor would not stop and would mercilessly deal with her relatives until everything around was drowned in blood. That is when it will not matter how wise the Empress is, because when there is no one left to protect or support her, she will have nothing to count on in this life. Of Thanatos, the Golden Empire, which was located among the boundless ice lands, walked through the empty hall. The clatter of her hook, against which she leaned, echoed throughout the palace. Her maid, who never for a moment left her mistress, followed her obediently. The maid doubted the loyalty of the Empress's decision, but did not dare to tell her about it. The Empress confidently leaned on a stick, because suddenly, due to recent unfortunate events, she began to limp and could not move freely without help. Sumset Rosaline V was considered the wisest, fairest, and most ideal empress in history since the day the Thanatos Empire was founded. She was a brilliant writer, known far beyond the borders of her empire, as well as a perfect diplomat who spoke 6 different languages and could communicate freely with ambassadors of other states. This great woman opened many medical institutions where help was provided to the poor, and the level of service there was even better than in paid medical institutions. The Empress personally visited the sick and tried to support them so that they felt needed and did not feel a lack of medicines. Even if she became lame because of her status, none of the inhabitants of the empire could say a bad word about her or accuse her of anything. Rosaline, in their own way, despite the fact that she was quite cold, but what she did for the empire earned the respect of her biggest critics. The only one who hated her, no matter how absurd it sounded, was the Emperor, and by mutual consent her husband, who should support and love his chosen one. For a long time they did not have children, and it was this that sowed enmity between them, which placed the husband and wife on different sides of the wall, through which they could not reach each other. Now, walking through the empty hall, the Empress thought that Gigliotti had destroyed all her followers and taken her only brother, whom he threw into prison. The woman perfectly understood whose hands this matter belonged to. The Empress considered her husband a fool, who was blinded by the thirst for power and jealousy, but she finally decided that as long as she had someone to protect, she would never give up. The maid actually felt sorry for her master, because even when she injured her leg, she returned to the palace, although everyone knew that the injury was due to His Highness. The maid every day worried and asked about the state of health and well-being of Her Highness, and the Empress always assured that everything was fine with her, although it was obvious how she was suffering. She was the kind of person who never publicly showed her true feelings and always said that everything was fine, although no one really knew what was going on in her heart. Looking at the back of the Empress, who confidently strode to the banquet hall, the maid wondered for a moment that fate might be so cruel to her because of her straightforwardness. In the quiet corridor, fragments of a melody could be heard coming from the festive hall. When there were only a few steps left to the hall, the maid stopped the Empress, turning to her. The maid did not dare to say anything and simply looked into the eyes of the Empress with a pleading look. Her Highness assured that everything was fine and asked the maid to open the door of the banquet hall. The maid didn't know how to dare, but nevertheless squeezed out the words that she would stay with the Empress until the very end, because she already suspected that today would be a decisive day in her life. The Empress bowed her head and thought that recently all her closest circle had left her due to mysterious circumstances, some due to illness, others due to accusations. The first to leave her life was the beloved servant Charlotte, who spent more than 16 years with the Empress, and one day was found dead in the royal garden. Next was the Minister of Internal Affairs and her trusted assistant. This man was accidentally shot while hunting, and until now the person responsible for his death has not been found. The deputy commander of the Emperor's army, who constantly protected the Empress, was also killed during the recent military events, and only Emperor Gigliotti was to blame for all this. Therefore, the Empress looked with fear at the maid Anna, and thought that she was the only one left in the life of the Empress, and therefore she did not want to lose this good woman. The Empress said in a calm tone that in case something happened to her, Anna should quickly leave the imperial palace and go to Noam's house on the beach without thinking. The Empress assured that the maid would be completely safe there, so he must carry out her order. Anna, with tears in her eyes, asked the Empress not to say such terrible things. Although the maid did not resist, the Empress insisted on her point, and then the maid bowed her head and said that she would leave her Rosa if there was such a need. A smile appeared on the Empress's face, and she said that she had not heard someone call her that for a long time, so she was very pleased, and she hoped that Anna would continue to remember her. Anna wanted to warn her mistress and offered her to wait a few days, because the Sante family and the Count of Sorrento are trying with all their might to find some evidence to justify the accusation. The Empress, leaning on her staff, smiled at the maid who was taking such care of her and told her to open the door to the banquet hall and not to worry about anything. Of course, Anna did not want to do this, but she could not disobey the order of the Empress. Therefore, with tears in her eyes, she opened the cursed door and bowed down. In the banquet hall, it was loudly announced that Her Highness had arrived, and everyone turned their attention to the woman who walked confidently, leaning on a cane, across the banquet hall to the imperial throne. The guests kept their eyes on the bold Empress. They certainly didn't expect to see her at this event today. After a few minutes, the Empress approached the throne in the middle of the hall, on which Emperor Gigliotti sat contentedly. This woman boldly looked into his eyes, showing that she was not afraid of him at all. Her courage sent shivers down the Emperor's spine, because he noted that despite her injured leg, she confidently walked across the hall at such a dangerous time for her. The Emperor, of course, did not expect her to appear at the party, so he asked the Empress how she got to this place with her sick leg. The Empress expected to cause surprise with her unexpected visits, so she replied with a smile that if her leg did not bend, it did not mean that she could not walk. The Emperor looked angry, but could not say anything out loud because there were many invited guests around. He noted in his mind that she was just a witch. The guests also could not fail to notice the tense dialogue between the Emperor and the Empress, and everyone, holding their breath, caught every word of their conversation. Among the invited guests was Minister of Foreign Affairs Amora, Tamon Krasis, who took a glass of wine, told his friend that she was a really brave woman because she came today. The Empress, looking into the eyes of His Highness, said that now she would look more carefully under her feet, and she would rather stumble once than turn from the right path. Emperor Gigliotti did not know how to respond to her true words, so he just bared his teeth in anger and humbly listened to what his wife told him. Even then, when the Empress stood in the middle of the banquet hall and boldly looked into the eyes of the Emperor, she understood that she would be the only one who would fall here. She needed to do this in order to preserve the treasures that were passed down from generation to generation in the Senset family and to save the reputation of her closest people. Suddenly, the Empress heard someone from the crowd address her, and by the voice, Rosaline realized that it was Natalia, who was covering her face with a fan and was about to approach the Empress. The Empress looked at the woman approaching her and realized that it was Natalia Roanti. Rosaline was also aware of her reputation and relations with the Emperor. Natalia's appearance raised a lot of questions for the Empress, because this banquet was organized for foreign delegations and members of the board were not supposed to be present at it. Rosaline had no idea why this woman was also among the representatives of other countries, so she asked her directly what she was doing here. But Natalia had her own mission at this banquet, so she bowed her head and in a guilty tone asked the Empress to order her, because she had committed an unacceptable act. And after waiting for complete silence, she said loudly to the whole hall that she was carrying a child from the Emperor under her heart. which she did not tell her own brother, and thus did not prevent his harassment. This was said so loudly and clearly that there was not a single person left in this banquet hall who did not hear such news and began to whisper about the fact that Natalia was pregnant by the emperor. The shameless woman continued to cover her face with a fan and tried to tell the Empress in a high-pitched tone that she was sorry about this, because if Brother Rosaline had known about it, he would not have pursued her. Then Natalia came close to the Empress and touched her hand as if apologizing. The confused Empress looked at the woman and did not understand what she wanted from her. But this cunning traitor transferred the bloody knife from the fan to the hand of the Empress and, crying loudly, fell to the floor. A shocked Rosaline remained standing with a bloody knife in her hand. The Empress also could not understand how a pool of blood appeared near the woman who had just fallen to the floor. People began to come to the aid of Natalia, who continued to lie on the floor without signs of life. The ambassadors began calling for someone to bring a doctor immediately to the banquet hall to treat the poor woman lying on the floor at the feet of the shocked Empress. Tamon Krasis also kept his eyes on what was happening and could not understand how the Empress got the knife so quickly and where she could hide it so carefully. The pleased emperor thought that at last the Empress had fallen into a trap and shouted to the soldiers to immediately arrest the criminal who had laid a hand on an innocent woman. Some shouted for Natalia to be taken to a safe place and help. Some called for the guards, begging them to protect them from the murderer. Some demanded the immediate arrest of the Empress. The woman who was lying on the floor in a puddle of blood involuntarily smiled. She was finally satisfied with what was happening, and she and the emperor managed to implement their plan to the smallest detail. Tamon Krasis felt that something was wrong here and did not believe what he saw with his own eyes. But the pool of blood in the middle of the banquet hall and the frightened foreign guests indicated the exact opposite. Emperor Thanatos shouted that the banquet was over, and he asked all the guests to go to their rooms. In his soul, he felt like a winner and finally breathed a sigh of relief that he was rid of the Empress. Tamon thought that the emperor had carved out the most influential and talented figure of Thanatos with his own hand, because he could not imagine how he could lose such a diamond that he had in his hands. It was a rather absurd situation when the Empress, who faithfully served the empire all her life, was in it in complete isolation and was waiting for certain death. Tamon's assistant suggested that perhaps this incredible woman would die before the end of this winter, and Tamon's heart felt even worse. After deposing the Empress Thanatos from the throne, the emperor tortured the poor woman every day without stopping for a minute. After all, he needed important information. Enduring incredible pain and torture, Rosaline still did not reveal to the emperor where the treasures of the Sante family were, because she knew his true intentions. No matter how much it hurt the Empress, she never once asked to stop the torture and held herself with dignity when the imperial executioners mercilessly abused her. Outside the imperial palace, ordinary people who heard about the punishment of the Empress came to the palace every day and demanded to reconsider the decision regarding her punishment. People who saw with their own eyes how their Empress helped all those in need and built various institutions for their help now sits in prison and did not want to put up with it. No matter how many days passed, the crowd did not decrease, and every day more and more people were added, who asked to pardon the Empress and release her. The emperor could not respond in any way to the wishes of his own people, so every day he went to the high wall and looked at the crowd, begging for mercy to the Empress. Gigliotti was angry and raged every day when he saw the strike of the people, because he hoped that their discontent would disappear after a few days, but it only grew and grew. The emperor understood very well that if he killed the Empress with his own hands, then this strike could turn into a real revolution, as a result of which he could suffer personally. And when Empress Rosaline lost consciousness and was no longer responding to anything, she was again doused with cold water, and the torture continued. Those were days of absolute hell for the young woman. One fine day, when she opened her eyes after another cold shower, she saw a familiar silhouette in front of her. Looking closely, she recognized that Emperor Gigliotti was standing in front of her. He smiled with satisfaction and said that during these days he was not able to learn anything from her, and it is very similar to her, the Empress of the Ice Kingdom of Thanatos. That woman remained stubbornly silent, and only looked at this devil, who was killing her more and more every day. He continued, saying that he never found out where her treasures were. Gigliotti said that he wanted to tear her to pieces, and the foolish people who every day chanted that he should pardon the Empress did not allow him to do it. The Emperor said that it is quite noisy outside the palace doors, and it has been going on for several weeks in a row. If they had listened, distant reviews of people would also have reached the torture chamber. Therefore, the Emperor looked at his wife and said that he would give her life, although he added in his mind that he was doing all this in order to save his own skin from a coup d'etat. He ordered his guards to immediately deport her to the icy mountains of Clorturia and abandoned her in the icy expanses so that no one could find out where she was now and help her. Then the Emperor looked triumphantly at his former wife and said that he had a rather interesting parting gift for her that would pleasantly surprise her. Two men in dark cloaks came up behind him holding a chest in their hands, and when they approached the Empress, the chests opened and severed heads flew out of them. The Empress immediately recognized the people whose heads fell to the floor and rolled to her feet. It was her father and mother. She screamed in shock and could not move. The Empress could not keep her silence, so she shouted out that she had the strength to name her husband and the last scumbag who had so treacherously dealt with her family. The guards were afraid of the enraged Empress, so they immediately applied force and pressed her to the floor and held her so that she could not do anything to the Emperor. The executioners held her with sticks and were afraid to approach the defenseless woman, who could not recover from the shock. The Emperor looked at her pain with satisfaction and rejoiced at his victory. The Emperor grinned and said that he didn't even know that the Ice Queen could show any real emotions other than calm, so he said that this expression suited her quite well. The young woman cried, looking at the heads of her parents, and at that moment she swore that she would never in her life forget and forgive the Emperor for his actions and would not rest until she took revenge. Tamon Krasis, sitting on a horse, looked into the distance where the capital of the Thanatos Empire lay before him. But his thoughts were far away, and these thoughts did not give him peace from the day when he was at the banquet. Despite this, it was already time for him to return home. He understood this, but something did not let him go, and he tried to stay in these parts as long as possible. The overthrow of the Empress of a state hostile to him caused him such rage that until now he had never even felt such a feeling in his life. With his penetrating gaze, he looked into the distance and saw in front of him the palace, where he had recently witnessed the unjust accusation of Empress Tanatsa. He did not know what the reason was, and an inner voice told him that one day he would destroy this accursed place where Rosaline was punished with his own hands. His assistant had already been waiting for the 3rd hour for Tamon to give the order to move on, and it was no joke that he froze. The only thing he wanted was to leave here as soon as possible, so he asked Tamon what he was looking at. Tamon continued to watch in silence, but the assistant didn't need an answer because he saw what was bothering Tamon and that it was he who was seen in the palace of the Thanatos Empire. The man decided to calm Tamon down, so he drove closer to him and told him that there were rumors that the Empress was deported to the mountains of Clorturia, where she was left to die among the snow-covered hills. The assistant expressed his displeasure that such a strong and intelligent woman was removed from the rule of the Thanatos Empire because she was more suited to this role than anyone else. Rosaline was an incredibly beautiful and strong young woman, so it was a shame to lose such a personality. At that moment, Tamon was struck by lightning, so he immediately pulled on the reins and made the horse turn 180 degrees. The assistant shouted that he had made up his mind and went after him. Looking after Tamon, who was rushing into the distance at an insane speed, the assistant only shouted that he should wait for him and not do any nonsense. The young man went in search of the one about whom he had been thinking all the last time, and even the cry of his assistant, who begged him to wait and not to do something stupid, could not stop Tamon. In the middle of the snow-covered meadow lay the almost naked Empress Thanatos. The wind mercilessly blew her hair, and the snow dusted her body, the pulse of which was almost unheard. The Empress did not have the strength to resist and fight for her life, so she decided to give herself to this snowy domain, and the only thing she thought at that moment was that Gigliotti be damned. She was very sorry that she could not protect the people closest to her, her father, mother, brother, her maid Charlotte, and other men who tried to protect her from the Emperor until the last. The Empress did not understand why she received such punishment and such hatred of her husband because she wanted to do everything right and only become a just Empress. Rosaline did not understand why her life was ending like this, and the only thought that warmed her soul was that in a few hours she would be next to her family, whom they would see again after death. Finally, Tamon managed to find her. Jumping quickly from his horse, he ran to the Empress, saying that she was lying among these ice hills as if she was going to rule this human palace. Leaning over the young woman, who was already a moment before death, he looked at her incredibly beautiful beauty and wondered why she was born in this cursed place. Tamon asked aloud why such a woman fell to such a scumbag Gigliotti, who did not for a moment appreciate the treasure he held in his hands. The young man was glad that he managed to find her. Looking at this snowy beauty, Tamon thought it was too bad he hadn't met her before she married the damned man who had left her here to die. But there was less and less time left to save her, so he decided not to delay and, approaching the young woman, immediately lifted her up and took her in his arms. Then he felt that her heart was still beating. Supporting the young woman, he whispered in her ear that if she herself did not need this life, then he would gladly take it for himself. He touched her lips with his lips and said that from now on the Empress would be his. Once the Almighty God decided to create a person and entrusted this process to a deity who collected all emotions and feelings to embody them in a person and proceeded to start this very interesting experiment. The deity lit a fire and placed a cauldron on it, where it decided to drop emotions one by one to create a person. Joy, sadness, anger, hope, expectations all flew together around the cauldron, waiting for their turn. The deity was pleased with the process and hoped to fill this cauldron with kindness as well. But he had to turn away from the cauldron for a moment, when the devil suddenly jumped at him. Therefore, people who were formed as a result of this process were constantly at the crossroads between good and evil, constantly trying to make the right choice on their way. It was because of the devil's action that people constantly got involved in all kinds of wars, the cause of which no one even knew. And they also tried to attack others over some trifles. And as a result of these conflicts, people killed each other. So the earth was filled with more and more deaths, and cemeteries grew with incredible speed. Having learned about this, the supreme god became angry and tore the creator of man into small pieces because he could not cope with the task that was set before him. And as a punishment for this, he scattered its pieces all over the land so that people, looking at it, would remember what happened and never dare to repeat something similar. The 6 elements of this deity were sealed into material objects that were filled with the power of heaven and earth, and therefore were of super powerful energy power. And the last pieces penetrated the human mind, giving it the ability to enchant and predict the future, control the weather, death, and even give life. And this last ability helped to restore life to other people, but thereby taking life-giving forces from the person who gave it. This is what Tamon did in his time. A few minutes later, he was riding his horse to his camp, carefully holding the Empress so as not to worsen her already serious condition. Then, making his way through the snow-covered hills, he caught himself thinking that he couldn't even believe that he was holding this amazing woman in his arms. There weren't many left before the camp, and Tamon thought that the Empress must definitely survive once he took her with him, so Rosaline had no other choice. In the meantime, his assistant helped the knights camp for the night, and managed all the processes so as not to forget anything, because at that moment their chief ambassador was absent. The knights pulled the ropes on which the tents were held and wondered how the inhabitants of Thanatos could live in such hellish conditions. After all, it was so cold here that they already wanted to go home. The assistant urged his subordinates on, reminding them that if they moved faster, it would be better to warm up and not complain that they are very cold now. Out of the corner of his eye, the man saw that Tamon was carrying a woman in his arms, and he immediately guessed who exactly he had taken to the camp. The assistant cursed mentally because of Tamon's actions. The man tried to stop Tamon and asked him what he was going to do with the Empress because he didn't want to get into any trouble over a woman they didn't know. Tamon did not pay attention to his cries and confidently carried the Empress to his tent. The adjutant wondered whether the corpse was being carried by his commander because the woman showed no signs of life. But despite neither the screams nor the cold, Tamon stepped into the tent and carried Empress Rosaline with him in his arms. Then the adjutant thought that his commander had lost his mind. Entering the chamber, Tamon found the bed with his eyes and decided to put the Empress there. It was quite cozy and warm in the tent, so he hoped that Rosaline would quickly recover her strength here. Now that the Empress was lying in his bed with almost no signs of life, he remembered their last meeting when he came as an ambassador to the Empire of Thanatos. Then the Empress, after carefully perusing the ambassador's demands, gave her firm decision that she did not approve of the proposal to give them the island in return for their protection from pirates. The young woman said that if they hand over this island to the Cupid Empire, then their territorial possessions will decrease by 3,000 meters, and this is quite a large piece of their empire. Then the Empress looked into the eyes of the ambassador and said that if they signed the agreement, their borders would extend with the Liger Empire, which would lead to new disputes. Tamon was not used to accepting any refusals, so he turned on his masculine charm and said that 3,000 meters is not so much, especially that they will take on all the controversial issues. Then Tamon told the Empress that if she really cared about it, she could choose any other island that would not cause disputes with neighboring empires. The very wise diplomat Tamon saw a pause and then said that such an island could be, for example, golden. Then the shrewd Empress immediately understood what he wanted. Rosaline then immediately told them that Cupid's ship had been wrecked off the coast of this island, so she immediately understood why they were so eager to take possession of it. The Empress smiled and added that most likely there was something valuable on this ship if the representatives of the country of Amor wanted to take back the volume and came here on a diplomatic mission. Tamon kept his eyes on the shrewd Empress, who saw through his intentions. Meanwhile, she continued to tell that the Sunset family had already raised this ship to land, so his efforts were useless. At that time, Tamon wanted to suppress this wise woman, but waited for what she would suggest. The Empress said they could return the treasure from that ship in exchange for something from their country. Tamon waited in silence for what the woman would offer in exchange for the treasures from the ship. She, smiling, offered Cupid to give the exclusive rights to extract the red cocoon. Tamon was surprised how such a trendy woman managed to negotiate the exclusive rights of the red cocoon for the production of the Cupid, thereby driving him into a dead end. He recalled their diplomatic dialogue and admitted that she picked on them and annoyed the ambassadors, but she was elegant and well-mannered at the same time. Now she was lying in his bed, far from her home, and barely breathing. He saw how hard the young woman took every breath, so he worried about her life. Tamon admitted that she was a diplomatic enemy for him, and he wanted to win the battle on the diplomatic front, but for the last time it was the Empress who came out victorious. Tamon saw how hard she was and decided that the life-giving force was not enough, so he decided to kiss the Empress once more to fill her body with life. His lips touched hers again, and then he felt that despite all their misunderstandings, right now he did not want to lose this woman, because he felt some feelings for her, and which he did not yet know. The body of the Empress began to fill with strength, and she barely opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was a man who was kissing her, and his figure was quite familiar. The young woman immediately broke free from the embrace and wiped her lips with her hand. She shouted at Tamon, asking him that he allows himself, and I expected some explanations from him. Not getting any response from the young man, she called out again, asking him what he had just been doing. Tamo-en looked away from the beauty and said that he was just trying to heal her, so it is not necessary to rehearse like that for the whole camp, and advised her to keep calm and recover her strength. The Empress asked Tamon to take her back to the ice mountain because she wanted to stay there, but the young man had completely different plans. Tamon wanted to hold her hand so that she wouldn't do something stupid, but the Empress started to break out of his arms and screamed that he wouldn't come near her and that she wanted to die. He held her fragile hand with his strong hand and felt that her pulse barely beat. She asked how she could go on living after what had happened. The Empress bowed her head and was sad. She said that after the death of her close family, after all that abuse and humiliation, she no longer wanted to live. She immediately remembered the last events and the insidious plan of the Emperor and Natalia, so she said out loud that she had no chance to return the reins in her native empire. Tamon tried to bring her to her senses and cried out that she had been banished from her native empire, to which she had devoted her whole life, and now she wanted to die among the snowy wastes. The Empress bowed her head and quietly said that she was. She has no strength left to fight, and she just wants to go to heaven to her family. Then the Empress looked the diplomatic ambassador from Amor in the eyes and said that he always wanted to step on her throat and considered her his headache. Then she took his hand and pulled it to her neck. Rosaline placed the fingers of his hand so that they embraced her and asked him not to save her from death again. And then, looking into his eyes, she asked him to kill her right now so that her suffering would finally end. Tamon touched her neck and felt the pulse of her arteries. He noted that this woman was worth an entire empire and admitted that she was indeed his biggest headache. Rosaline humbly waited for her death. She didn't have the slightest desire to live. The young man thought that her neck was so thin that one wrong move and he could just break it. He looked into her eyes and decided that he could easily take her life if he only wanted to, and he was worried about something else, the fact that she had no desire to live. And then Tamon thought of the Empress, with whom he was conducting diplomatic negotiations regarding the sunken ship. He knew how tough, confident, determined she could be. The woman he was holding by the neck was completely different from the cold Empress. She was a completely broken and morally destroyed woman who wanted to leave this world more than anything. Then the young man made a decision and released his hands from her neck. He told her that since she wanted to die herself, he would not be her weapon in that decision. The Empress looked at Tamon in confusion because she did not expect that he would make such a decision and not take her life. Meanwhile, he paid attention to her legs and touched them. She watched his every move in fascination, and then she saw how the young man bent down and began to gently kiss her leg. She screamed that he was allowing himself and tried to tear her leg from his hands. But the young man was not going to give up her leg, so he said that he was treating her and asked her not to twitch. Ignoring her remonstrances, he continued to kiss her leg. Rosaline was not going to tolerate this, so she kept trying to pull out her leg and provoked the young man, reminding him that he was her enemy and then asking him to stop. The Empress realized that her threats had no effect on him, so she gathered courage and said that she was asking him to let her go. This was the last drop in the young man's patience, so he shouted at the woman to keep fighting and never give up. He was surprised that she asked him. Rosaline looked at the young man and could not believe her ears, and he continued to shout that he did not believe that she was asking him, because this is not at all characteristic of strong women. Tamon was looking into her eyes, and it was as if his gaze was penetrating to the very depths of her soul. He said with him or anyone else, but she has to keep fighting no matter what. The young man reminded the Empress how a few days ago she defeated him on the diplomatic front, taking away the right to extract the red cocoon from the Cupid Empire. And then in a stern voice he told her to keep fighting, and he wouldn't let anyone break her. The man admired her determination and courage, so he wanted her to stay that way. Each of his words resonated in the soul of the Empress, and she realized their meaning. At the same time, Tamon said that this is her path, and she should go through it to the end and with dignity. When it was already quite late and everyone was resting in their tents, Tamon decided to take a walk in the fresh air. He approached the exit, and before leaving the tent, suddenly turned around. The young man looked once more at the Empress, who was sleeping peacefully in his bed. Even in this state, she was the most beautiful woman in the world, from whom it was difficult to look away. Meanwhile, in Emperor Gigliotti's palace, the main bodyguard of the imperial army came to him for an audience. The emperor expected good news from him. The emperor looked at his subordinate and asked if he was 100% sure that the Empress was dead. He really wanted to get a positive answer, so he waited impatiently for it. The subordinate said that he was absolutely sure of this, and then the emperor asked how he could be sure of this, when it was not possible to find the body of the Empress until now. Then the man told the emperor that at the place where they left the Empress, they found traces of blood, so they were sure that wild animals had torn her body before she died. The emperor thought a little and decided that this version was quite believable, so it must have been so. Gigliotti then asked the commander if they had succeeded in finding the relic. Drops of cold sweat appeared on the commander's forehead because he knew that the emperor would not like the answer and was afraid to pay for it with his head. Nevertheless, he said that they still haven't managed to find the relic. The commander added that she had most likely been kidnapped a long time ago, but the emperor shouted that this could not be, because until the last days, she was always next to the empress. The emperor shouted that the empress could not hide it far, so he ordered to immediately search all the places where she could have put it and find the relic in the shortest possible time. The commander of the imperial army bowed his head and said that everything would be as the blessed son of Thanatos ordered. Then, bowing his head, he said goodbye to the emperor and left his chambers. Left alone, the emperor began to reflect on the recent events that had taken place in his life. Then the man felt that he felt sick, and nausea, which was increasing, did not give him peace. The ability passed down from generation to generation by the rulers of the Thanatos Empire was death. It is they who have drunk the ability to choose whom they can remove from this earth with their own hands. This ability was given to the emperor by heredity together with the crown. But depending on the personality of the emperor himself, the ability was expressed in different degrees of its power. Gigliotti himself was not as great as he wanted it to be, and compared to the rulers who ruled before him, it was simply meager. The emperor could use this ability only on people, infecting them with the plague and thereby dooming them to a long and hellish death, but the emperor was proud that he had at least this ability. In addition, every time after its use, it brought quite serious consequences, and these consequences were directly proportional to the number of people killed by Emperor Gigliotti. And since he had recently cleaned almost the entire entourage of Empress Rosaline's closest people with his own hands, now it was time to answer for his actions, and he suffered from a terrible reaction. In addition, he was furious because he could not finish off Rosaline with his own hands, and it was all because of a marriage ceremony between representatives of the imperial families. Operator Thanatos tied the knot with Rosaline by mixing his own blood with holy water, and this drink was drunk by the Empress during their ceremony. This ritual was performed so that neither of the spouses could point a weapon at each other and wish each other death. Therefore, he tried to remove Rosaline in another way. But no matter how much the emperor tried to get rid of his wife, the relic that was passed down from generation to generation in the Sunset family possessed divine power and did not allow him to do it. As the emperor felt a little better and moved away from the effects of his ability, Gigliotti began to smile, telling himself that he was much better. And then the emperor stood up and began to laugh at the whole room, saying that he had finally managed to finish off the empress. And this simply amazing feeling of satisfaction and victory came over him. Gigliotti roared that he had the strength and shouted that he was just a great guy, because he coped with such a difficult task, and came up with such a cunning plan to do everything properly. While he was flaunting his own victory, a picture of him hanging on the wall miraculously broke loose and began to fall straight down on the emperor. The picture fell a centimeter from the emperor himself, and he barely managed to jump back. Gigliotti looked at the picture lying on the floor and was shocked that he could be right under it. Hearing the extraneous noise in the emperor's chambers, the emperor's maids and guards immediately ran into the room and began to ask him what had happened and whether he was feeling well. Having surrounded the emperor from different sides, the servants tried to understand what happened here and helped the emperor to recover from such an accident. The emperor only now realized what could have happened to him, so he replied to his servants that nothing special had happened and asked them to help him to his feet. Gigliotti looked angrily at the picture and ordered the maids to immediately take it away from his sight. Now he realized that this damn painting had almost killed him moments ago. The emperor could not move away from the shock, and therefore began to examine the wall on which the picture hung, and stopped his gaze on the picture that remained hanging on the wall with the image of his wife, Empress Rosaline. While the servants cleaned up the consequences of the accident, the emperor did not take his eyes off the image of the empress, who was smiling sweetly at him from the picture, as if saying that this is what he needs. The emperor was so angry that he took out his sword and began to beat mercilessly with it on the picture with the image of Rosaline. He shouted for her to die and took all his anger out on her. The frightened servants froze in place and did not take their eyes off the angry emperor, who mercilessly beat the picture with his sword, shouting curses in the direction of the empress. Only when he had no strength left to strike the picture, he stopped and began to breathe heavily. Now he realized what he had done and that all the servants had witnessed what was happening. The completely destroyed picture continued to hang on the wall, and the image of the calm Empress seemed to pierce the Emperor, telling him that he was a fool who would soon be punished. Realizing what he had done, the Emperor threw his sword on the floor and knelt down. His head hurt so much it felt like it was splitting in half, so he held it in his hands and howled in pain. The diplomatic delegation of the Cupid Empire had been passing through the desert for several days in a row. The sun mercilessly burned their skin, but they moved in the direction of their homes. Rosaline rode next to Tamon, who gently supported her to make her feel as comfortable as possible. She mentally noted that it was extremely hot outside, but it was still better than the cold. The young woman's gaze rose higher to the man's face, and she, stopping on him, thought that several days had passed, how they were together, and how long she did not remember. The Empress remembered their night, and her feelings after that were incomprehensible to her. She wanted to kill him for what he had done, and at the same time wanted to be with him even more. Then Rosaline turned her attention to her hands. The last time she looked at them, they were all in wounds that would not heal in any way, and now the picture was completely different. Her skin became snow-white again, and no traces of wounds were visible on it. But the Empress did not take any medicine, so she wondered how her body could recover so quickly. Rosaline looked again at the brave man who was riding next to her and thought that maybe the reason was in him and in his divine abilities, because she could not find any other explanation. Rosaline nevertheless came to the conclusion that this simply could not be. She had already researched this question before, but never found an answer. The Empress knew for sure that people had not seen the fifth divine element for the past several hundred years, and she very much doubted that it was located in Tamon. Still, Rosaline was troubled by her speedy recovery, for after such torture she was to die within the first hour of being abandoned among the snowy mountains. Tamon noticed that Rosaline was already awake and asked her how she was feeling. The Empress replied that although he had saved her, she could still die at any time. The young man was very pleased with her thoughts, so he kept looking into her eyes, thinking about what to answer her. And then Tamon replied that no matter how many times she died, he would still save her again and again because he hoped she would be by his side for the rest of his days. Then Rosaline did not take his words seriously enough and continued to ponder over her miraculous healing. Finally, the gates to their city began to be seen ahead. Driving closer to the wall, Tamon announced that this was his city and his country, so he is glad to see the Empress in him. He wanted to show her all the beautiful cities of his homeland. Through the gate, the diplomatic delegation entered the city of Gwinish. It was the capital of Cupid. As soon as the gates opened, a huge crowd of people began to joyfully welcome the ambassadors home. People cheerfully shouted Tamon's name, and Rosaline immediately understood that he was very popular and loved by the local population. The man happily smiled back at the people. But then he again turned his attention to the young girl, because he noticed that she began to sink into sleep again. This alarmed him very much, and he wanted to ensure Rosaline's peace as soon as possible. Without taking his eyes off the Empress, he noticed that she began to breathe heavily and lost consciousness again. It was necessary to act immediately, and therefore he decided not to visit the imperial palace. Then the man called his assistant Ronaso, and he looked at Tamon in surprise, waiting for what he would say to him now. Tamon, in a serious tone, told Ronaso to report to the Emperor himself about the results of their diplomatic mission, because he had urgent matters and he had to solve them immediately. Ronaso tried to deny Tamona, because he had never reported on cases on his own. This mission had always belonged to this man, so he shouted after him where he was going. But the young man only shouted to his horse to go faster and gallop off in the opposite direction. The confused assistant just looked at him. Arriving at his home, Tamon greeted the servants who were already waiting for their master. The chief steward asked why he returned home so quickly and did not visit the imperial palace. Tamon only replied that there were good reasons for that, and the manager told the maids to immediately put their master in order and serve a cooked dinner. The manager asked what kind of woman he was holding. Tamon only asked if a bathroom had been prepared for him, and the manager immediately led Tamon there and opened the door. Entering the bathroom, Tamon said in a rather serious tone that from this moment on, no one is allowed in there. And the manager bowed his head, showing that he understood everything. The door to the bathroom quickly closed, and the young man carried his beauty to the pool. The water in it steamed, and it was clear that it was quite warm, which pleased Tamon very much. A fast-moving young man stripped down to his underwear. He couldn't wait to take a bath after the difficult journey from another empire, especially when his Empress was by his side. The young man unwrapped the Empress from her upper clothes and carefully examined her body. He was interested in how her body was recovering and whether the wounds were healing quickly. The bruises had already completely disappeared, so the body of the young beauty looked snow-white and clean. Tamon gently took the young woman in his strong hands and carried her into the water. His heart was beating fast when he was near her, so he couldn't wait to wash her as soon as possible. But as soon as her body touched the hot water, she immediately regained consciousness and started screaming in surprise. The young man smiled with satisfaction and asked her how the water was. Disgruntled, Rosaline shouted to him, asking where they were, because she couldn't get a good look yet, due to the fact that she had recently fainted and did not really understand where she was now. The young man looked her in the eyes and told Rosaline not to worry, as they were now in his private bath at his home. Rosaline asked if it was really his bath. Rosalie had heard that people in hot countries like to bathe in large amounts of water, but before that she thought that only members of royal families were allowed to have such huge baths. The young woman began to examine the bathroom and noticed that Tamon's personal belongings were carefully hanging on a hanger by the pool. But the Empress was especially interested in a dagger for self-defense, which was also there among personal belongings. Then she decided that this would be a good opportunity to use it. The young man also noticed where the Empress was looking, so he asked what she was looking at so intently at the other end of the pool. Rosaline looked away so as not to reveal the subject of her interest. The Empress, covering her body with her hands, told the young man that, after all, he had made the wrong choice when he saved her from death. But the man confidently came closer to her and, looking into her eyes, said that he would decide whether it was the right choice or not because it was his choice. It was clear from the tone of his voice that he was not kidding. Then the young woman told him that he was quite self-confident, and Tamon, smiling, answered that there is no person on earth who would not be self-confident. The Empress moved a little further from the young man and asked him what was the point of bringing her to his house, let alone washing together in the bathroom. As she spoke, his gaze fell on her breast and she noticed it. Therefore, covering herself with her hands, she said that she did not know that Tamon of Amor was so weak for women's beauty. The young man blushed a little, stroked his head with his hand, and said that he himself did not know this until he met her, and especially he did not think that he would want a woman from an enemy empire so much. But the Empress sharply answered that if he needed a woman, then he should find someone else for this occupation, and she thinks there will be many willing people all over the country. Tamon smiled and looked at the Empress. He liked her better like this, so he said that, of course, at least weed out those who wanted to, but he only needed her. The Empress objected, saying that one might think that she was the only one he needed. Tamon began to approach the young woman and said that he needed exactly what she had. Rosaline began to walk away, getting closer to the edge of the pool, and answered that there was nothing special about her. But the young man said in a confident voice that the Empress was very wrong. Meanwhile, the young woman had already left the pool and was standing next to the hanger, and Tamon said that she has good looks, wisdom, heart, beauty, perfect body, experience, intelligence, courage. The young woman listened with her mouth open, because no one had ever told her so many compliments in 1 minute. He continued his sentence and said that this is all he needs. The young woman saw that the man was not paying attention to where she was going, so she quickly went to the hanger and grabbed the dagger that he had just left there. And then she put it to his throat and said that in that case, he wouldn't get any of the above anyway, because she decided otherwise and sharply ran the dagger across her throat. Tamon didn't even blink an eye when his beauty was lying on the bathroom floor in a pool of blood, and his bloody dagger was lying next to her. He shouted the word curse and rushed towards her. The young woman was losing blood, and her pulse was getting weaker and weaker. The man looked at her, asking why she did this, because he had already saved her from death once. Then Rosaline, losing consciousness, thought that the reaction of this young man was quite strange, and she was not used to such excessive attention from men. After all, her own husband, and by implication, Emperor Thanatos, only dreamed of removing her from his path and mercilessly killing Rosaline. The Empress thought that, unlike the Emperor, this young man was trying to bring her back to life for the second time, at the cost of his own health, because the use of magical abilities had to be paid for. The wound turned out to be shallow, so Tamon managed to stop the bleeding quite quickly. The young man was very concerned about Rosaline, so he kept his eyes on his young beauty. He was quite enraged by her prank, so he asked her in all seriousness how she dared to die again in his presence, since he was already tired of saving her from death. Then the Empress remembered his words, which he had said to her when she found him in the snow-covered hills, and these words were that if she did not need her own life, he would take it at his own pleasure. The young woman opened her eyes and looked at the young man. Tamon said that he saved her with his ability to restore life, so he shouldn't be so irresponsible. Tamon approached the Empress and hugged her tightly. Holding his beauty in his arms, he whispered in her ear that he would hold her so tightly until she realized that she was only his. Tamon's bathroom from Cupid, Rosaline realized that this man wasn't going to just let her go and die unless she really wanted to, so she had better think of something else. Lentifu was the queen of the Amor Empire, and now, seeing her ambassadors, she hastened to greet them, calling out the name of Ronaso and expecting good news for their empire from her ambassadors. The queen asked why they were not yet in the palace, and why they had taken so long to travel through the whole city, because they had already waited for them, and even went out to meet them at the gate. At that moment, Ronaso was thinking about Tamon and how this scumbag had set him up like that, because now he would be doing it for them himself. The queen asked if he could hear her because he was not answering questions. But there was nothing to be done, so Ronaso approached the queen and bowing said that thanks to her prayers they had quite successfully overcome such a long and difficult journey from the empire of Thanatos. The queen said that she did not expect a different answer from her best ambassadors, and then, after examining the delegation, she asked where Tamon was now, because he was not noticed among those present. Ronaso hesitated, and didn't know what to think of, so the first thing that came to his mind was to say that Tamon had caught a sore from Emperor Thanatos, but added that he was feeling better now. The queen was surprised that Tamon had fallen ill, and Ronaso hastened to assure that everything is fine. He just went to his home to recover his strength after a difficult journey. Then the queen smiled and joked that at the sight of Emperor Thanatos himself, one can immediately get sick from his boring expression. So it is not surprising that Tamon is not feeling well. Then the queen said that she was very worried about his condition, for Tamon had never been seriously ill before, so she decided to go at once to him and visit her ambassador. Ronaso didn't know what to come up with, so turning to the queen, he remarked that before going to Tamon, he should congratulate the entire delegation that had just returned. Then Ronaso joyfully asked the queen if she had heard of the latest news that had happened in the kingdom of Thanatos, and that the emperor had died this time, and if not, he promised to tell everything in the smallest detail. The queen decided that this would be more appropriate, so she called out that they would first hold a welcoming ceremony for their ambassadors and invited everyone to the banquet hall. As soon as Ronaso turned away from the queen and breathed a sigh of relief that he had managed to solve this problem, the queen called her faithful servant and whispered something in her ear. Ronaso shouted to his comrades that they should go, and everyone got on their horses and rode to the palace of Queen Amor. Unexpectedly, the maid, to whom the queen gave the task, secretly from the representatives of the delegation, approached one of the ambassadors and addressed him with a request. The man stopped his horse and prepared to listen carefully to the maid. She told him that she had an urgent conversation that did not require delay and invited him to follow her. After that, the ambassador turned his horse 180 degrees and followed the young maid who was heading away from the palace. Tamon's bathroom. The young man couldn't resist and started passionately kissing his beloved again. He couldn't believe that he could have lost the beauty a few minutes ago. Rosaline was beginning to come to, so feeling his ardent body close to hers, she thought that maybe this was how he was taunting her when he brought her back from the other world. The Empress pushed Tamon away and told him to wait. Then she caught her breath and looked him intently in the eyes, demanding an explanation from him. But the young man just silently looked at the Empress. She was wiping her lips and thought that by some miracle she had managed to fully regain her strength again. Tamon smiled and asked his beauty if she regretted not being dead now. Of course, he hoped that this would never happen again, and she would not do such nonsense. The Empress looked at Tamon and waited for him to continue his conversation, and he asked her not to look with such a look, because this look excites him so much that he may not control his actions. Rosaline couldn't believe what she heard, that her look turned someone on. After all the time she spent in marriage with the Emperor, he allowed himself to joke in front of strangers that he had to spend the night somewhere in the stable. The ladies of the world laughed merrily at the Emperor's words, and he continued saying that hugging a doll was much more pleasant than a cold Empress, although I perfectly understood that she heard these conversations. Listening to such jokes every day, Rosaline completely despaired of her beauty, and he constantly emphasized that any man would cool down next to the Empress. Therefore now Rosaline did not even know how to react to such compliments and asked Tamon to leave her alone. Tamon asked, surprised, what exactly she didn't like. But after his question, the Empress firmly answered that she was not going to obey all his wishes and orders, even after he saved her from death. Looking the young man straight in the eyes, she asked how many more times he would save her, and whether he thought that her attempts to end her life would end there. And then the Empress said in a completely angry voice that she herself would decide whether to live or die, and she would not allow anyone to interfere in her life. Tamon did not take his eyes off the Empress and remarked to himself that of course she was right about this, but most of all he liked the tone in which she said it. Now Rosaline was nothing like the woman who had begged him to end her life when they were alone in the tent, and this confident beauty turned him on even more. The young man caught himself thinking that she looked much prettier now than he had seen her in all her finery in the royal palace. Lights appeared again in her eyes. The young man reached out to her and touched her chin. He said that the way she is now, she drives him crazy and he can't control his actions. But Rosaline was not going to tolerate his liberties, so she resolutely rejected his hand and asked him never to touch her again without her permission. And then the Empress lowered her gaze and said she had one more request about her lips. She asked him not to touch them whenever he wanted. Then the young man decided to agree to her demands and, looking down, said that he would not touch her lip if she did not like it so much and promised to keep it. But then the young man looked into her eyes again with such a look that sent shivers down her spine, and said that he swears not to touch her lips, even if he really wants to. Rosaline asked the young man if he didn't hate her because until today she thought they were enemies, and then she asked why he wouldn't let her die in peace. Then Tamon admitted that the young woman was constantly bothering him in the diplomatic arena, and he could confess this to her. But to hate her was out of the question. The young man noted that no matter what, he gave her all the necessary vitality so she can continue to enjoy life, but Rosaline said she didn't ask for it. Then Tamon decided to look for the positive side of her so-called resurrection and offered to find some reasons why she should continue to live. The Empress looked at the young man with interest and decided to listen to what he had to offer her. Then Tamon said that these reasons could be revenge, or hatred, or the fall of Thanatos. That young woman, after listening to his proposals, thought a little and answered that she was not interested in any of the above, especially spending her life on such meaningless things. Then Tamon moved closer to her, took a lock of her blonde hair and whispered almost in her ear that maybe one of the reasons that would make her go on living would be love. These words shocked the Empress, and her eyes sparkled. He laughed, saying that he likes her expression very much, and it seems that he got into the top 10 with his guess. That night, when the Empress got into bed in her bedroom, she noted that it had been quite a busy day and she should think about it. But as soon as her head touched the pillow, she fell into memory. Several years ago, the capital city of Thanatos was attacked by some magical beasts. They did not deliberately choose their victims, but quickly and mercilessly killed everything that came in their way. These creatures appeared so suddenly that no one was prepared for their appearance. In an instant, a rift formed in the sky, through which huge horned monsters descended to the ground. One of the guards yelled that the monster was headed for the shelter where His Highness and his wife were right now, so they needed to send as many troops there as possible. The family of the emperors with their charitable mission was currently staying in the shelter for homeless children. They understood that they were attacked by monsters and the guards were all trying to tame them on the street. The children cried from fear and told the Empress that they did not want to die. She reassured them as best she could, saying that they will definitely be saved, so you just need to wait for help. Suddenly, the wall in the room broke, and one of the monsters headed for the children. The Empress said in her mind in displeasure that it was just some kind of horror that this crack had formed at this very moment. Rosaline hugged the frightened children, and after mentally assessing the situation, she decided that it looked like they would not be able to hold out until the Imperial army appeared. The Emperor's face was visible, that he is also scared to death. Still, manly dignity did not allow him to escape, so he took the sword in his hands and prepared to meet the monster. Holding a sword with one hand and the other as if protecting the Empress, the man decided that the monster would be frightened and run away from his formidable appearance alone. Having assumed a military posture, the Emperor said that there is no need to worry and he knows how to handle weapons well, so now he will definitely deal with the monster and everything will be fine. The monster had completely different plans for the Emperor, so he ignored him, knocked the sword out of his hand, and ran towards the Empress, who was protecting the children. The children began to scream in terror, and the Empress pressed them closer to her, trying to protect them from a collision with the monster. The monster was rushing straight at them at breakneck speed. Rosaline decided that not only her life would depend on her quick decision-making, but also the lives of the frightened children. So she reacted quickly and ducked to the side, a second before she collided with the monster. And at the moment when she rolled to the side, the monster caught her leg with its horn and hellish pain pierced her whole body. The Empress opened her mouth and did not dare to scream, so as not to frighten the children even more. The Empress knew that these monsters were very sensitive to extraneous sounds, so she could also attract the attention of other monsters with her screams. At that time, the Emperor shouted over the piece that he was ready for battle. But the Emperor did not have time to make his pathetic speech that the greatness of his imperial anger is so great that he will deal with the monster now, when it kicked its hind legs and the man flew away. Having been thrown several meters away by the impact, the Emperor fell to the floor, and a stone, which broke off from the wall during its collision with the monster, hit the Emperor painfully in the nose, and he howled like mad. The Emperor crouched down, holding his nose, and shouted to the entire shelter how he was in pain. Rosaline looked at him, and it was clear that he was not that good at military affairs. Standing on all fours, the Emperor cursed and asked loudly what the Imperial soldiers were doing in the street and when they would finally come to rescue them. But the monster ignored his claims. Having met the eyes of the monster, the Emperor was so frightened that he rose to his feet and rushed as far as he could. He ran and screamed so loudly that even the children were more frightened by his scream than by the appearance of the monster. The Emperor quickly passed the crowd of children and hid behind the table, which was turned against the wall, forming a kind of protective structure. The children looked at the Emperor with a condemning look, and the older ones understood that the Emperor was trying to use the children as human shields when the monsters attacked him. The Empress thought that now they were all in extreme danger, and therefore it was necessary to make some decision to save the children because His Highness could no longer be counted on. The eldest of the children immediately realized that only the Empress could save them in such a critical situation, so he dared to get up and quietly run to Rosaline. At that moment, Her Highness's gaze stopped at the sword lying on the floor after the shameful battle between her husband and the monster. Therefore, she decided that in this situation, he would not interfere with her at all. But getting to the sword was quite difficult, because there was a monster near it. Therefore, the Empress decided to distract the monster and asked the older boy to help her. The Empress explained to the boy in as calm a tone as possible that he should run to the wall from which the monster appeared and scream very loudly. So she decided to distract the monsters. Together they boldly looked ahead. The Empress decided that now the salvation of all children rested on her and, despite the unbearable pain in her leg, the woman decided to take a risk. The boy was also very scared, but he trusted the Empress and decided to try. Therefore, he ran as fast as possible in the direction indicated by Rosaline and began to shout loudly. Rosaline rose to her feet and firmly decided that she simply could not ignore such a chance that the boy had given them, risking her own life. The boy ran and screamed loudly, closing his eyes. At that moment, he imagined how all this would soon end, and they would once again live in a cozy shelter next to their Empress. Finally, the Empress managed to reach the sword and boldly took it in her hands. Leaning on both legs, one of which was excruciatingly painful, she swung and plunged that sword into the monster's back. Even the Emperor shuddered at what he saw. He did not expect that his wife was so brave that she could deal with the monster so cold-bloodedly, risking her own life.